All right, hello and welcome to our webinar session, which will focus on the baseline criteria standards for school safety that were recently revised and adopted by Pennsylvania School Safety and Security Committee. My name is Sam Cook, and I'm the Director of Policy and Planning for the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, or PCCD, as we're more commonly known. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Kirsten Kenyon. Kirsten, you want to say hello?
Hello, everyone. My name is Kirsten Kenyon, and I am the Director of the Office of Research, Evaluation, and Strategic Policy Development, also at the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency.
Great. So Kirsten and I are going to be walking you all through a couple of the changes that were made to the baseline criteria standards that were adopted back in May of 2023. And we're also going to cover some basic information about the purpose and the use of these standards, including how they specifically connect to some of the funding programs that PCCD administers, including school mental health grants and school safety grants. So we'll be covering an introduction to the baseline criteria standards, what's in the new and revised 2023 standards, a little bit on how schools should reference and utilize this criteria, including some new resources that we've developed to assist school entities in that process. And then also talking a little bit about how baseline standards connect to some other school safety initiatives that your school entity may be already working on. And then finally, we'll be covering where schools can seek assistance and support if you have any questions about baseline criteria or any of PCCD's other school safety initiatives. So first up, Kirsten's going to walk us through a little bit of an introduction and history for the baseline criteria standards. So Kirsten, take it away.
Thank you, Sam. So way back in 2018, the General Assembly and the governor signed Act 44 into law, which established the School Safety and Security Committee within PCCD. Accompanying that law was a budgetary investment of $52.5 million in funds to support grants to school entities to pay for a wide variety of physical security enhancements and behavioral health improvements for schools. At that time, there was a list of about 21 original activities that were added to the public school code to outline what schools could spend their grant funding on. Schools could come in for any of these activities so long as they were allowed for by law. So that first year, there was a lot about it. That was a learning process for PCCD as an agency, and quite frankly, for our stakeholders, the schools themselves. A couple of things that stood out from that original grant process in particular was that we clearly saw that schools often didn't know what to prioritize for their funding needs. Funding requests were typically all over the map in terms of programs, services, and capacity, something we like to think of as a program potpourri. That first round of grants also had a significant competitive component. So we frequently saw that schools that were better at grant writing and articulating their needs ended up being better poised to review well and score better in comparison to those schools that did not have that leg up. Also, it became very clear that there were significant resource disparities among school entities in terms of what was already in place from a safety perspective. So in response to this first round of 2018 grants, one of our school safety and security members, State Senator Jim Brewster, suggested that the committee take on the task of establishing baseline criteria to help provide guidance to school entities. He suggested that we develop criteria to help prioritize schools' physical security needs and behavioral health needs. His overarching goal of this concept would be that all school entities in the Commonwealth would be places where students can learn and teachers and staff can feel safe because basic foundational school safety and mental health elements would be in place. And as you all know, kids can't learn and adults can't teach in an environment that's not set up to meet their basic needs. So based on Senator Brewster's suggestion, the School Safety and Security Committee formed several multidisciplinary work groups throughout 2020 and into 2021 to develop the first set of baseline criteria, which were adopted by the committee in 2021. That original set of criteria was created solely as a resource to schools and used a multi-leveled approach with the most basic foundational elements a school entity should have in place as Tier 1, or as it was later named in the 2023 version of the criteria, Level 1, to more advanced criteria in tiers 2 and 3, respectively levels 2 and 3. Again, the original criteria were only developed as a resource, and they were not tied initially to school safety funding. This changed, however, with Act 55 of 2022, when the baseline criteria were referenced in state law as part of the grant program. For that year's grant program, school safety funding for school districts, intermediate units, charter schools, and career and technical centers was tied to meeting Tier 1, or as I said, Level 1 standards first before they could expend funds on other eligible project activities. School entities were asked to provide information about whether they met physical security and behavioral health baseline criteria as part of their grant applications. This was the first time they were asked to do this. Because it was so new and because the baseline criteria standards weren't originally designed with funding in mind, we learned quite a bit in the fiscal year 22-23 administration of those grants. I will now turn things back over to Sam to kind of outline some of those lessons.
Thanks, Kirsten. So just a couple of kind of takeaways from that initial pilot year, so to speak. So we did learn that baseline criteria did help move the needle on some pretty key aspects of school safety and mental health supports. So we did see school entities using grant dollars for that most basic tier 1 or level 1 grouping of activities for both physical security and behavioral health, which makes sense since they were required to do so by law. It also provided a chance for school entities to utilize those available resources like PCCD grant funding to help fill in some of those gaps identified through the baseline criteria process. And thanks to all of those efforts in our first year, we certainly know a lot more about the landscape of school mental health and safety and security than we did just a couple of years ago. And that information has been really invaluable for state decision makers. And so we really appreciated some of those insights through that process. But as with anything, that's the good, but there was certainly a lot of lessons learned, as Kirsten mentioned. And so we took a lot of notes during that first year about how we could make the process better moving forward. So just a couple of things that our staff heard and observed during this process. We definitely recognized that there needed to be a more common language to support effective implementation in schools. For example, providing clearer definitions and exploring other mechanisms to ensure that both the letter and the spirit of baseline criteria standards were achieved. We also recognize that there was a need to better align baseline criteria standards with existing statutory requirements and mandates related to school safety and mental health that school entities were already tasked with doing, and to also distinguish between the different types of school entities that serve students across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And finally, we felt like there was a strong opportunity to update and improve baseline criteria based on all of the feedback that was provided from school entities during the grant process, as well as from subject matter experts, and to hopefully help streamline the grant process that's now connected to those standards. So with all of that in mind, what's in the 2023 baseline criteria standards? So we worked with more than 60 stakeholders over the course of 2 months to review the originally adopted 2021 standards and take a look at them really from the vantage point of those lessons learned, as well as to consider more recent best practices that have emerged in the field. And so the result of those efforts were the 2023 revised baseline criteria standards that were adopted by the committee in May of 2023 and are in place today. So what changed? First, at a very basic level, we updated the terminology from tiers to levels, and that was based on feedback from the field that this might reduce confusion with some other types of models that are used by school entities, for example, things like multi-tiered systems of support. We also took the opportunity to reevaluate level 1 criteria based on common gaps and feedback that were provided by school entities during the fiscal year 2022-23 school safety and mental health grants process, and to more closely line up and connect with existing requirements and mandates that school entities need to follow pursuant to state and/or federal law. So the revised criteria standards include a number of references and citations to these requirements throughout the documents for quick reference for what those mandates are and look like. These revised standards also recognize that some critical basic needs might not be covered by the baseline criteria standards explicitly, but might instead be identified through an assessment that's conducted by a qualified entity, for example, a physical security assessment or a behavioral health and student assistance assessment that would be school entity or school building specific. And as such, we did create a new option to use grant funds for critical gaps that are identified through professionally completed assessments that are conducted according to the assessment criteria standards that are adopted by the School Safety and Security Committee. We also took the time to consider ways with the group to reframe baseline criteria to acknowledge the different nature and context of different types of school entities in Pennsylvania. So in the original 2021 standards, several baseline criteria, both behavioral health and physical security, did not really have a practical application for different types of school entities like career and technical centers or intermediate units. For example, there was some language around fencing around play areas that didn't really apply to career and tech centers, for example, that tend to serve older students. There's also a lot of baseline criteria in the original version, especially for physical security, that really didn't contemplate the unique context of cyber schools, just as one example. So when we were looking at revisions to these standards, we really tried to make adjustments to ensure that criteria is more universal, particularly at that most basic level 1. And then we also recognized, again, from listening to folks through the 2022 grant process, that there needed to be some greater flexibility for school-based mental health services and supports that meet baseline criteria. So this was an issue and concern that came up pretty frequently during our grant review process. And while we certainly recognize, and our work groups did as well, that they're the gold standard for providing mental health and related supports for students, a lot of school entities cited some pretty significant challenges in terms of finding people who were trained and certified as school psychologists, school social workers, and related professions. And so we often heard that there weren't enough certified individuals within a given area for a school entity to hire full-time, especially in our more rural communities. So as such, the revised baseline criteria for behavioral health now emphasizes access to qualified mental and behavioral health personnel and services and supports as level 1 criteria. So as an example, a level 1 criteria now states that school entities should have a student services plan in place that includes access to a qualified school psychologist and qualified social work services, which echoes requirements that are already in play for school entities in Pennsylvania. And finally, we updated the standards to reference new requirements in place for school entities, such as the school safety training requirements that were established through Act 55 of 2022, as well as best practices that were identified by subject matter experts and education practitioners from the field. So if you want to see more details on how the revised 2023 standards look different from the original 2021 versions, we certainly encourage you to check out the crosswalks that are available on PCCD's website for more detail. So at a high level, we talked a little bit about some examples of how some things have changed, but the 2023 physical security baseline criteria are really organized across 6 different sections or areas. So the first section is on physical security assessments, which again tie to assessment criteria established by our School Safety and Security Committee. The next section talks about school, campus, building, and classroom security. There's criteria that details expectations around school security personnel and law enforcement, communications, coordination with first responders, and emergency operation plans or EOPs, and then finally a section on school safety and security training drills. The behavioral health baseline criteria in its revised version includes 7 sections or areas. The first is on student assistance and behavioral health support assessments. The second is on student assistance program or SAP. The next section is focused on mental behavioral health personnel and services and supports. There's a section on school climate, one on staff training, another on trauma-informed approach plans, and finally one on threat assessment and management. So just to show you what that looks like in practice, we actually have these standards available on our school safety website. So if you go to our school safety section, you can scroll down and there's a section on baseline criteria standards. You can click on the revised baseline criteria standards and it takes you to a web page that includes the new revised standards for both behavioral health and physical security, as well as some other resources that we'll walk through in just a moment. So we mentioned that the revised standards have different sections. This is what they look like when you open them up. So we're looking at behavioral health right now. You can see that under each top line area, it's organized with level 1 criteria kind of all the way to the left, level 2 in the middle, and level 3 all the way to the right. Both the physical security and behavioral health criteria documents are organized pretty similarly. And so this is a way to kind of help organize the criteria thematically. And you can see there's also some footnotes and resources kind of peppered throughout. We mentioned some of the statutory citations, so you can see some examples of that kind of as you scroll through the document. So moving on to kind of one of the tools that we developed. We recognize that this is a bit of a shift in practice, and so we wanted to do everything we could to help school entities kind of navigate the new standards and really be able to evaluate how your own policies, procedures, and practices align with these revised standards. So we created 2 interactive self-assessment checklist tools, which are Excel spreadsheets that you can download off of that same website that we were just on. And so this Excel tool actually breaks down each of the elements of the revised criteria standards by both level and area. And it also includes some grant funding examples for level 1 criteria, just for quick reference throughout. So school entities can use this document to really take note of where they do have alignment with those standards, whether it's fully met, planned to be met or implemented, not met, or not applicable. And then there's also a section where you can take some notes. So I'm going to walk you through just a quick example of sort of what that looks like on our website. So if you go back over here, you're going to download the document by clicking here. It'll pop up. You can just click on it and it pops right up. So the very first tab is on instructions. So it'll walk you through kind of how to use the checklist. It is interactive in the sense that it'll start sort of, tallying up, for example, the number of gaps that you have depending on how you answer certain things. So as an example, if you're in the Student Assistance Program tab, the first criterion is whether or not you have a process in place for the coordination of services as part of SAP. You can select your kind of rating of that specific criterion. So let's say you don't have it up and running just yet for whatever reason, but you plan to. You can select that and you can see that it'll be color-coded according to your response, and it'll also start to flag as a level 1 gap since this is a level 1 criteria. You can use this last column to provide some notes on action items, some context for why you provided that rating, etc. And then you'll also see that because this is a level 1 criterion, it does provide an example of how you might be able to use school safety and mental health grants available through PCCD to potentially fill that gap and what the eligible project activities look like for that area. So you can continue to select and populate. Again, it'll kind of tally things along the way. After you go tab by tab, which is organized by the sections and themes of the baseline criteria, it'll actually provide you with a high-level summary of all of the level 1 gaps, level 2 gaps, and level 3 gaps that you have based on your responses. And again, our hope with this is that it's really helpful both from a funding perspective. So if you're applying for grants, whether from PCCD or elsewhere, it's a great strategic planning tool to kind of figure out where you might need some additional resources to support your school entity's practices. And we also hope it's just helpful to inform other types of planning discussions with school-based teams and other efforts. So heading back over to our PowerPoint, I'm actually going to pass things over to Kirsten, who's going to talk a little bit about how the revised baseline criteria connect to the 2023-24 grants process. So Kirsten, you want to take it away?
Sure. Thanks, Sam. Yes, so for fiscal year 23-24, as part of the school code that just passed, Act 33 of 2023, baseline criteria is again required, particularly for the school mental health grant funding for this year. As with last year's grants program, that was a $90 million formula-based allocation to school districts, charter schools, intermediate units, and career and technical centers that they can use specifically on mental health activities. As last year, school entities must demonstrate that they've fulfilled their level 1 behavioral health baseline criteria, um, or once or they can use grant funding to meet their level 1 gaps. Once they have met their level 1 gaps for the mental health grant funding, they can then expend funding on any other eligible project activity allowed for in the law. The baseline criteria is also going to be used as part of the competitive grant application for this year. Priority consideration is going to be given to those competitive funding requests that help meet level 1 gaps for school entities and non-public schools. And that would be for both the physical security side and behavioral health side activities that are allowed for in law. That would impact the competitive public school safety and security grants and the targeted non-public school safety and security grants. While PCCD is cognizant of the fact that the baseline criteria are drafted with public schools in mind, they do set a nice standard for non-public schools to also have in line to provide basic foundational security elements for their students and staff. So both competitive applications will be using baseline criteria to help with prioritizing requests that are coming in. To help all school entities out with the baseline criteria, we have created additional annotated baseline criteria guides to help school entities see examples of activities that grant funding can support. On that page that Sam showed you earlier, you can click on the link directly beneath. Thank you, Sam. The link directly beneath the bolded revised behavioral health baseline criteria standards. You can check the one with grant funding examples. And what we have done is we have auto-populated examples underneath each level to give you an idea of what that activity allows for, what that baseline criteria allows for, and also the appropriate corresponding activity that's allowed for in law. We would encourage you to go to this document and check it out in case you were wondering if you needed any ideas as to items or activities that you can purchase or use with your funding in order to help meet that particular level 1 or advanced level activities. Thank you, Sam.
So now that we've covered some of the resources, we wanted to just touch briefly on how baseline criteria standards connect to other school safety initiatives that your school entity may already be engaged in. So as we mentioned earlier, a lot of the updated baseline criteria standards were really designed intentionally to mirror existing requirements for school entities related to school safety. And so just at a very high level, those include areas covered in both state and federal law related to civil rights laws and regulations, professional development requirements, including training, emergency preparedness and planning mandates, certainly school safety laws and regulations, as well as laws, regulations, and other kind of expectations related to student services. So for example, just to kind of rattle them off, from a federal perspective, this can include federal civil rights laws, federal laws like the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, or IDEA, At the state level, when you look at baseline criteria standards, you're going to see citations for things like Act 55 of 2022's school safety training for school employees and school safety and security coordinators. Lots of citations for the PA Public School Code, as well as citations of regulations, including Chapter 4, Chapter 10, Chapter 12, Chapter 339. And then there's also references to mandates found in Title 35 related to emergency preparedness for schools and similar facilities. So again, our hope is that a lot of these requirements are already familiar for school entities and that baseline criteria standards are now much more closely aligned to the things that your school is already expected to do by virtue of federal or state law. So with all of that, we want to make sure folks know where to go for assistance and support. So I'm going to turn things back over to Kirsten to help close us out.
So if you have any questions, PCCD is here to support you. We strongly encourage you to check out the resources available on PCCD's website related to school safety and security, including all of our baseline criteria standards on the webpage that Sam walked you through earlier. That includes the revised baseline criteria standards, the crosswalk document that compares the old 2021 original versions to the new 2023 version, so you can see what is different between the two models. We also have that baseline criteria self-assessment checklist tool for school entities to use that also conveniently has drop-down boxes within it to provide you with examples of various activities and items that schools can request funds to support through their school safety grant applications. We also have examples provided within the PDF documents that are just beneath that tool on our website. And as ever, if you have any questions about the revised baseline criteria standards, please feel free to reach out to our team. The best way to reach us is through our email account. It's a resource account, and it is ra-cd-sssc, which stands for the School Safety and Security Committee, at pa.gov. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll turn things back over to Sam.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. And thanks for your time. Appreciate it. And if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to our team. We appreciate you and the work that you do on behalf of Pennsylvania's students and schools and communities. So hope you have a good rest of your day.